Now, the latest ONS data on population growth, Patrick, very interesting, showing in England, the population up 6.6%, almost 3.5 million between 2011 and 2021. Interestingly, when you look at Wales, it was only a 1.4% increase in 10 years compared to a 6.6% population increase in England, which just shows you this isn't, evenly spread, this population surge that we're seeing. And surprise, surprise, 57.5% of the rise, the majority of it, due to net migration. Some areas that we both know quite well, Patrick, Cambridge, for instance, a 17.6% population increase in 10 years. Peterborough, a 17.5% population increase in 10 years. And it just astonishes me, Patrick, that when you see on mainstream media talk about housing crisis, talk about NHS waiting lists, talk about local services, the huge population increase, which isn't exclusively, but is mostly down to net migration, barely gets a mention in any of these stories on mainstream media.
Yeah, and not only is there the direct impact of net migration over the last 10 years, there's also previous migration, producing kind of bigger families as well. So that's a double impact. And how we can talk about any of these issues without addressing the core question of, what level of net migration can this country cope with? We know when people come to the United Kingdom, they overwhelmingly choose to settle in England. England has the highest density of population of any major country in Europe, I think the fourth highest in the world. We all feel the stresses and pressures about access to public service. The housing issue, is an absolutely massive issue, which is stopping, people of your sort of age and slightly older bring up their own families, basically, which we want to see. People who are functional, employed, would be good parents. The only people who can afford to be parents really seem to be the very rich, or the people who are entirely welfare dependent, and that's driving a demographic hole in the population, which isn't good news. But far too many, and I sound like an old duffer here, of your generation, I would say, swallow this idea that to be woke, that it's not nice to talk about immigration being the problem, and the problem isn't enough, that not enough houses are being built. But if people are being led to believe that if they do let their local green and pleasant land become another housing estate, or just be bought up by a load more migrants, then they're not going to be remotely persuadable of that. So I think the generation that's being locked out of the housing market needs to get real and confront the fact that, at the moment, Boris Johnson particularly, it just seems to be a complete liberal on immigration from all corners of the world.
Well, it's supply and demand. And we see a lot of talk about how many houses we're building. The number of people requiring houses isn't fixed, is it? It's down to partly what level of net migration you run each year. And Patrick, for me, this is one of the biggest missed opportunities of Boris Johnson's government, because don't forget, both Theresa May and David Cameron both pledged to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands. Neither of them could do it, because obviously we're in the European Union with EU open borders. Boris Johnson could now deliver that. He could say, look, previous Tory leaders and prime ministers talked about this. I'm delivering it. It would be massively popular in the country at large. And Labour would have to then justify why they backed mass migration. And I just don't see why Boris Johnson's government aren't coming out and committing to delivering what was a Conservative policy that they can now deliver post-Brexit.
Well, indeed, and particularly, as you say, that the Tories promised this for over 10 years in a row, and never in a single year did they actually fulfil their promise. And Boris Johnson suddenly gets the legislative freedom to fulfill that promise if he wants to, and clearly he doesn't actually want to, and he's giving kind of open checks to Hong Kong, huge schemes in Afghanistan, Syria, Ukraine, with no ensuing kind of clampdown on immigration volumes from elsewhere, perhaps more visas for Indian nationals as well. The guy wants to run a high immigration policy. And what he had hoped to do is focus all the public angst on illegal immigration, where he's put forward the Rwanda scheme, but he's not even managed to implement that. So I agree, particularly in the Red Wall, if we actually had succeeded in even bringing net migration down to say 90,000, which by long historic standards is still very high, that would have really energized the Conservative base and the new working class supporters. And it's one of the government's biggest failures. It's sort of not. It's potentially its greatest strength. It's not exploiting it. It's not delivering it. And again, we ask, what does Boris Johnson really believe in?
Do you think there's any chance of the Conservatives going into the next election with this commitment to bring net migration down to under 100,000?
Well, I think Boris Johnson abandoned the actual figure, and the last Tory manifesto talked about lower overall volumes of immigration. Exactly the opposite has happened. I don't really see it. I think they could be made to restore that, but only if there was an extra force in British politics, quote, to the right of the Conservatives, Farage style, that was really offering exciting ideas and connecting. And I'm afraid I just don't see that. If you look at the recent by-election in Wakefield, there was an independent candidate came third, the Yorkshire Party came fourth, and Reform UK only came, I think, fifth. It's just not getting the traction. The branding or the messaging just isn't there. And there's a gaping opportunity for someone. But as you and I know, it's not easy. It's not easy to create an insurgent force, which then the media can't ignore and then serves as a single rallying point for voters who want to push immigration control.